Good morning, hydrangea lovers. This is Tony Fulmer from Chalet, and we're going to be talking this morning about 25 all-star hydrangeas, and this is the time to be thinking about hydrangeas. I notice we're really filling up the nursery with lots and lots of fresh product. So what we're going to start with today is, since you're at a little bit of a disadvantage. If you were in class, you would have our wonderful handouts with all the details that we put in there for you. So I know you're writing, so I will try and be a little bit slower, and I will try and repeat things. And we're going to hold all the questions until the end. But what we're going to talk about, we'll have overviews of the arborescence hydrangeas, which are the smooth hydrangeas, the panicle hydrangeas, the mop heads, the oak leaves, and then save the best to last, the climbing hydrangea. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. My assistant will help me, since I fully admit and readily admit to being a techno dinosaur. There we go. All right. So 25 all-star hydrangeas. Carly, there we go. We're good. Okay, smooth hydrangea. The best example, the one that you're probably most familiar with, is Annabelle. And this is the smooth hydrangea. Hydrangea arborescens is a US native, so that's always a good thing. The important thing we need to understand with hydrangeas is that you need to understand whether they're flowering on new wood or old wood. In other words, current season's growth, are they blooming later in the season? So they're blooming on the growth that they made in the spring, or are they blooming a little bit earlier and they're blooming on the growth they made the year before? So that will impact your pruning decisions, and I will be very specific when we go through each of these different species. I will try and clue you in on the best way to prune so that you don't negatively affect your flowering performance. The smooth hydrangeas have that big softball-like flower, and they had that big soft leaf. So just like coleus and other soft leaf things, they prefer some shade. When we get into really warm weather, and it gets hot and dry, even if they're mulched, established plants may still even need some supplemental water. But the thing about them is they're ironclad hardy, so there's absolutely no winter protection needed on these. So here's the trusted old friend. This is Annabelle, which most of you know, and we sell hundreds and hundreds of Annabelles because of the shade tolerance. And on the North Shore here, with all the shade we have, people are looking for something that has a conspicuous flower. And when you put that big white softball-like flower in a shaded area, it really pulls your eye in and really lights up a dark spot. So Annabelle, like all the other arborescens, blooms on current season's growth. So that means that you can cut it down very dramatically. She matures at 4 to 5 feet tall with a 4 to 5 foot spread. But if you want to control the height, and if you want to keep it smaller, you can really treat it like a perennial and cut it back from, if it was 5 feet the year before, in late March or early April, you can cut it back to 4 feet or 3 feet or 2 feet. Or some people do a complete cut back all the way to the ground so that they leave it only about 4 to 6 inches tall. Now what that means is later in the summer, you'll have a shorter plant, you'll have a more compact plant, and it will bloom a little bit later in the season for you than if you had left it standing at 3 feet or 4 feet tall. It does tolerate a good bit of shade, but we mustn't, I always like to underline, you mustn't confuse tolerance, just like life. You mustn't confuse tolerance with preference. She will tolerate half day or even more of shade, but what will happen is the plant will be taller, it'll be a little bit thinner, and you won't get as much bloom. And that's also when you're going to get weaker stems, and the plant's going to tend to what I call flop and slop, where you get the weight of that big flower on the end of the stem, and it's going to tend to open up, especially if you've had a little bit of rain on that heavy flower. It will tend to open up because the cells are elongating, trying to find light. So just know that the more sun that you give it, up to 4 to 5 hours, the more compact the plant will be and the more flowers that you will have on them. The arborescens type, these smooth hydrangeas, are not particularly heavy feeders. So you want to be a little bit careful, and contrary to some of the other ones that we'll talk about, a gentle feed on those, something like hollytone, the espoma hollytone, which is a 4-3-4 fertilizer. The first number is nitrogen. That's what promotes leaf and stem growth and leaf color. The second number is phosphorus, and that's what promotes lots and lots of blooms, assuming the plant gets enough light to utilize those nutrients. I would be remiss as a University of Illinois graduate not to give kudos to our former Professor J.C. McDaniels, who is actually the one who selected this plant. He found it, he propagated it, and he marketed it. And so it is to his credit and University of Illinois' credit that Annabelle is probably one of the most popular plants in the United States. Incrediball. Incrediball is one of those serendipitous experiments in horticulture. Horticulturists, plant breeders were looking for an Annabelle that had a heavier stem that could support that big softball size flower better, even if it was in a little bit of shade. So they were breeding and selecting, and they were looking over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and they noticed a plant that had a particularly heavier stem, which was exactly what they were looking for. So they got very excited and they started propagating that plant. And lo and behold, the flower was not only was the stem thicker and heavier and better supporting the flower, but also the flower was bigger. And, you know, we Americans love bigger, and bigger is always better. So we have this bigger flower. But the interesting thing is when you look at the density of an Incrediball side by side with an Annabelle, it can have up to 4 times the flowers. And that picture on the right, I think, really illustrates that. Even as the flower is drying, you can see that you have a lot of density. And it should be mentioned that these arborescens hydrangeas really dry nicely. So for those of you that want to do craft things and make wreaths with them, they really dry extremely well. So they go through color phases, both Annabelle and Incrediball. So I think the easiest thing to do is think of Incrediball as Annabelle on steroids. So it's just bigger and heavier with a thicker stem. So they go through the buds are green, and when they first come out, they look a little bit like broccoli florets, and then they open up to that big white flower. And like all the hydrangeas, the fresh flower part of it, when it's that color, in this particular case, white, it stays that way for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that's another reason for the popularity of hydrangeas. Not many plants have that length of bloom. And then not only do you have that bloom fresh, but then they go through color phases. And then in the case of Incrediball and Annabelle, they go to a paper bag brown, and they'll stay that way over the winter. So you really get months and months and months of flower effect from them. So Annabelle and Incrediball both have the potential to get 5 feet tall, and they sucker. And I think you can see that in this photo. Every year they add more new stems from the base, so they get broader and broader and broader. I wouldn't say they colonize, but they definitely get wider and fuller. Okay, this is Invincibelle Mini Mauvette. And this is the 2nd or 3rd generation of hydrangeas, of smooth hydrangeas that have a color other than white. And so you have this lovely dusty rose pink. The plant will get 3 to 4 feet. This one gets about 30 to 36 inches tall with about a 3 to 4 foot spread, but you get that really nice rose pink bud. And then it fades or ages to that softer pink, and then it finally finishes, as you look over to the right half of the plant, that soft pink. That's how it finally ages. So this is a real improvement or addition to the whole arborescens family, and it's something that people were looking for. We might as well say it right now, because this is pink. The genetics are not there. This is not one of the mophead types that you can cause it to be pink or blue based on what the soil in pH is. Very strong stems on this. Again, this one gets 30 to 36 inches tall, 3 to 4 feet wide. Then the companion plant to that is Invincibelle ruby. And Invincibelle ruby, the primary difference is that the plant is a little bit bigger. It can be 3 to 4 feet tall with a 3-foot spread. Now, neither of these have that big softball-like flower that Annabelle has. It's proportionate. And so the stem issue, I find that the stem supporting the flower issue is not such a consideration with these pink varieties. And this is the one I really like. This is Invincibelle Wee White. And they've been looking and looking and looking and trying for years to get a dwarf Annabelle. And here's Invincibelle Wee White. And again, it's the same species as the forehead of it. And so it has some shade tolerance. It's a real cutie. It only gets about 24 to 30 inches tall. And after many years, it might be 30 to 36 inches wide. And the flower is proportionate. So it's a smaller flower. It's not quite as domed. And what I see with mine is, especially in cooler weather, when it comes out, there's a really, really nice pinking to the flower. So it's pink and then white and then brown. So again, Invincibelle Wee White, perhaps 30 inches tall and 30, after many years, maybe 36 inches wide. Stems are strong on this. Okay, the next class, the other species that we're going to talk about today that has created so much interest are what we call the big leaf hydrangeas. The species, the Latin binomial, if you really care, is Hydrangea macrophylla. And they are from Japan, and there are 2 distinct types. There is a mophead type, which again has the big softball-like flower that is not dissimilar to Annabelle. And then there's a lace cap, and the lace caps are flat, and they have lots and lots and lots of little fertile flowers in the center, and then they have 1 or 2 rows of bigger, what we typically think of as the hydrangea flower. A wide brim around the edge of 2 or 3 rows of the sterile flowers. So it's a very, very, very different look. Now, bullet point 3 here, I want you to take that with a grain of salt. It says the potential to flower on new wood and old wood, even with climate change in Northern Illinois, typically we'll have enough cold temperatures close to 0 that unless you have given them extra protection, they will tend to die back pretty close to the ground. So generally speaking, even though they have the potential, most of these varieties have the potential to bloom on new wood and old wood. Generally speaking, the old wood is kind of a moot point because you'll typically end up pruning them pretty close to the ground every single year. Now, these are less shade tolerant as far as producing a compact plant with lots of flowers. I would say an ideal situation would be an east exposure or northeast exposure or a northwest exposure. 4 hours or more, a half day, 5 hours of direct sun will be really good. And an east exposure then would give them some shade in the afternoon, because they're not really happy when it's 100 degrees out in the summer and they're baking on the south side of a house or the west side of a house. So if you can give them some shade, that would actually be preferable. And again, most of these do require additional winter protection if you're serious about trying to save both last year's stems, at least a portion of those, and the new stems. And the reason that you would want to perhaps do that winter protection, it gives you the bonus of an additional early crop of flowers. So if the plant is protected, the stems don't die all the way back to the ground, and you have 2 or 3 sets of buds on the previous year's flowers, that's early flower potential. And then the new stems that are rising from the base, what we call the new wood, you will have the potential for a second crop of flowers on that a little bit later in the season. And you're asking yourself, what would be the best way to winter protect them? I asked a nurseryman many years ago, and he said, what I would do is just build a little bit of a cage Or if you want to take the old rose cones, those ugly white rose cones, and maybe cut the top half of that off, if you can constrict the plant, maybe tie it up with some jute twine and get all the stems together, so you can either put a cage over it of chicken wire or something, if it's a younger plant, an old rose cone, anything to hold some chunk bark. Now, not shredded bark. Use the chunk bark, like medium or large chunk, and just fill that 6 to 8 inches, and that will protect those. That'll give you insulation, a little bit like when you're protecting your roses. The bark will give you just enough, those stems, just enough protection that they may make it through the winter for that early crop of flowers. There's another point that I wanted to make about that. Everybody wants to know, can we use leaves? Can we use straw? I think in a perfect world, you probably wouldn't do that. Even if you shred the leaves and pack the leaves in there, they have a tendency to hold too much water around the stems, and the stem tissue that you're trying to protect may actually freeze over the winter. So I would use something coarse like the bark that allows any fall rains or snow that's melting to work on through, and so you have better air circulation around the stems for the winter. And then you, just like the rose protection, you would take that off in the end of March or first part of April. So enough. It's interesting to me. So I guess it's human nature. Here in our area with our alkaline soils, the pH is going to cause the flowers to be pink. And everybody, it seems, here wants them to be blue. And you can do that, but you have to really, really work on it, because it's a function of how much, I'm not going to bore you too much with the chemistry, but it basically, the lower the pH, the more aluminum that's in the soil that's available to plant. It's actually the amount of aluminum in the soil that will actually cause the plants to start working from pink to what I call purple, which is kind of purplish blue, which is the pink moving to the blue. And if you do a really good job, and if you really get that soil acidified with the sulfur, then you can actually start getting something that's actually bluish purple, but it's more blue than purple. So I think it's, I've often thought that garden centers out on Martha's Vineyard, where the soil is acidic and where the hydrangeas are going to naturally be blue, I'm sure everybody out there wants to know how they can make them pink, where all the people here, all of our guests, want them to be blue, but they're going to be pink if you don't do anything with them. So let's look at some of the varieties that are available. Bloomstruck is the successor to Endless Summer. And if you notice, I have not included Endless Summer in here. I think Bloomstruck is a superior performer. While the flowers may be a little smaller in size, you actually get flowers with Bloomstruck after a serious winter. So there's a bonus to this. If you look at this right hand of this triptych here, you get that nice red stem, and the leaf petioles, the stems of the leaves, are also that nice red color, which is a nice a color bonus as you're waiting for the flowers to come. And as you see here, this is that thing where when you look at picture number 1, you get what I call that purple, that blue, purple, pink. So you can have multiple different colors of Bloomstruck on the plant all at once. And it does have a tendency, because it has flowers over an extended period of time, because of last year's shoots and new shoots arising from the base, it is actually considered to be a bit of a rebloomer. Now, the one thing that's easier to do if you're serious about trying to get these hydrangeas to be purple is to do them in containers, because if they're in containers, you can control the soil pH much better than if they're in the ground. So again, Bloomstruck is one that has the potential to bloom on current season's growth and year-old wood. I have stopped winter protecting mine, and I just cut them back to the ground. And usually I have stems a couple of inches tall, and right now they're 6 to 10 inches tall. And so I'll have a crop of flowers in July with that. The other nice thing about Bloomstruck, it is resistant to powdery mildew and leaf spot that will sometimes affect some of the other hydrangeas. This matures, has the potential, even if you cut it back to the ground, has the potential to be 3 feet tall and 4 feet wide. This is also a good point to say, to express that with these mop heads or lace caps, the ones that we're talking about right now, as opposed to Annabelle and the other varieties, these are much more apt if you're giving them the half day of sun that they need. These are heavier feeders. And so if you want to really coax the maximum amount of flowering out of these, what I would suggest is that you fertilize early in April when you are doing your cutting back of dead stems from the winter and maybe cleaning up last year's leaf debris and taking off last year's spent flowers. And before you put the mulch on, use anything that you would use for roses or perennials. So you could use something, one of the things that I use is the Dr. Earth bulb fertilizer, because it's actually a 3-14-2. So you have 3% nitrogen to give you leaf and stem growth and leaf color, and you have 4 times as much phosphorus. So if you're getting that phosphorus to the plant, you have the potential for much, much, much more flowering. And this is probably a good point to remind people that fertilization does not compensate for lack of sun. So give these largely these mop head height types, give them 4 to 5 hours of direct sun, some shade if you can. Always give them ample water when we get into hot, dry spells, and mulch them. Doesn't matter what your mulch is, the plant will be perfectly happy, whether it's a shredded bark or whether it's leaf mulch, but do keep after them and keep them evenly moist. Now here's the new star of the macrophyllus, and this is called Summer Crush. And this is year number 2, I guess, or 2 or 3 that this has been on the market. I think last year was the first full year. I was fortunate enough to get a sample of this plant in the fall of 2018. So mine wintered over that horrible, horrible winter out in the garden when we had temperatures down to 30 below. And to really test it, I had not done any winter protection with it. So I was curious to see what happened, and last spring I had 19 flowers on it with no protection. And 20 feet away, and in fairness, in a more exposed location, but Twist and Shout, a variety I'm going to show you in just a moment, and Bloomstruck had probably 6 to 10 flowers, and because they were not protected. So the cool thing about this is you get this, they call it red. I don't think that's really red. It's a really deep rose pink, but you get a nice compact flower that's very showy on a dwarf plant. So this is seldom more than 30 inches tall. It can be 36 inches tall with about a 30 to 36 inch spread. So Summer Crush is an up and comer. So I think the 2 that you really want to look at if you're looking for these mop head types would be Summer Crush and again, Bloomstruck. And these pink blue types, I'll reiterate once more, these are the ones that if you want to blue them, you can do it, but it's going to be lots and lots and lots of work. People are going to ask at the end of class here, what about aluminum sulfate? You can use aluminum sulfate, but you have to be careful about using it too frequently because you can actually get aluminum toxicity. So what you could do is use sulfur in the planting hole because sulfur is a long-term acidifying solution. And you would top dress, in other words, when you're doing the cleanup in the spring, you pull the mulch back, you put the sulfur in contact directly with the soil. You never put sulfur on top of the mulch. It has to be in contact with the soil. Then you water it in, then you put the mulch over. Twist and Shout. Now this was what I was referring to earlier with the lace cap. I think you can really see it on the right-hand side. Those little flowers in the center are fertile. And so that's as big as they're going to get. And then you have, that's why they're called lace cap. And then around the edges, you have that ring of 1 or 2 rows of sterile flowers. So the nice thing about the Twist and Shout, it only produces this type of flower. And so you don't have that weight on the end of the stems. So they're really self-supporting and they do a nice job of that. It can be at maturity. It's probably because we tend to cut it all the way back to the ground every year. It's going to be 4 feet tall with an equal spread. Moving to a different type. This is the type that when I started in the business almost 50 years ago, Panicle hydrangeas, no one even really talked about them. And now Panicle hydrangeas are the rage. And they're called Panicle because that's just the taxonomic term for the shape of the flower, which is elongated and kind of cone shaped. So these are from Asia, these are from China and Japan. You have the cone-shaped flowers, and these really, really, really like sun. And again, this gets to tolerance versus preference. They will tolerate part shade, but they're really going to perform best. They're going to stay most compact. They're going to have the most flowers if you give them lots and lots of sun. And that can actually be sun all day long with these. And once they're established, they're very drought tolerant. You'll see in the upcoming pictures, they have a smaller leaf, so they don't have the water loss issues that some of the other hydrangeas have. So once they get established, they're not as water needy. And some of the dwarf forms that I'm going to show you work extremely, extremely well in containers. No winter protection on these. They are rock hardy to zone 5, and so that's totally a non-issue. Could be used in containers. The pruning on these bloom on current season's growth. Typically, these are blooming from July into August. Some of the later varieties like Tardavote will be blooming in September. So you do your pruning, and what I do, because of all the hydrangeas, I think the panicles hold their flowers over the winter the best. So you'll have lots and lots and lots of, once the plants get established and they're blooming a lot for you, you will have lots of dried flowers from the year before. And if nothing else, I think that's the one thing you want to get out and clean up in March, early April, is to take all those spent flowers off. And when you finish doing that, you don't really have to do a hard pruning on these. But remember, when you're pruning, start at the center, and I like to crown or have the highest stem in the center. And then as you prune the sides a little bit more gradually, always above a pair of leaves. So when you finish, the silhouette of the plant before it starts growing should be naturally rounded. And then when it grows out, it will be rounded and it will look natural as opposed to just chopping it straight across the top. I will reiterate, these cannot, no matter what you do, no matter how much you want it, you cannot make these blue. That is the strict province of the ones that we just talked about, the macrophylla types. This picture on the right was the marketing picture that I saw of Bobo, and it's been out long enough that I've kind of lost track. It's probably been on the market 6 years, 7 years, something like that, but it was in Europe before that. And I saw this picture on the right, and I thought, this can't be real. This really can't be the case. This is a marketing thing, and folks, it's not. This plant is a flower machine. It is incredible. The beauty of it is a dwarf plant that matures at 3 to 4 feet tall with a 3 to 4 foot spread. You get this full size, 6 to 8 inch, big, dense, cone-shaped white flower. And it literally, after they've been in for a year or two and the plants are established, if they're out in full sun, you literally can barely see the foliage. The plants are absolutely covered with these exquisite flowers, and they're this beautiful, pristine white for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then they start pinking a little bit, and they age pink before they go brown. And I'm not exaggerating. I have 2 different groupings of 3. And when I was trimming off the flowers this spring, it actually got tedious because there were so many of them. And I counted, and one plant had 109 flowers on it. So it's really hard to beat that kind of performance in a dwarf plant. And again, anytime you get these dwarf plants that are 3 to 4 feet tall or 3 to 4 feet wide, this would be a great container plant for those of you that don't have soil to grow your plants in. Firelight is another favorite. All of these panicle types, they start white, and what differentiates them is the mature size of the plant or how the flower finishes. And Firelight it goes from white to a soft pink to this beautiful, dusty, kind of an antique rose color that you're seeing here on a plant that gets 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide. And again, remember, so you have white for weeks, then it turns to pink, and then you have the dried flower heads on this. Really strong stems. Most of these panicles do a really nice job of supporting the flower because it's not as dense and heavy as Annabelle. Limelight is, to me, it's really interesting in that I didn't know when this came out how literally a chartreuse flower would be received. And again, from left to right, you see it starting white, and then it literally goes to this wonderful, wonderful chartreuse color. And I guess the thing that Limelight has taught me is that in the garden or in a container, that chartreuse is really a neutral color, and it works with everything. So you can use that, if you're changing, if you have a long shrub border or a perennial border, and you want to kind of change color themes from like hot colors of oranges and reds to more soft, cool, romantic colors like purples and pinks. You could use this as kind of a palette cleanser, if you will. That chartreuse really kind of sets the stage, and it's a nice bridge from one color family to another. Limelight gets fairly large. It has the potential to get 7 feet tall and 7 feet wide. Now, the one thing that we need to mention about the panicles is they're available either as a shrub form, or some growers are growing a very limited number of the varieties, and I underline limited. Not all the varieties are available, but trained as a tree form to a single tree. So for those of you that are looking for a dwarf ornamental tree that might not get more than 8 to 10 feet tall, these tree form panicle hydrangeas could be a really, really nice way to go. Now, what you're going to see with the panicles is the fact that many of them, there is a full-size model, and then for those of you that are looking for an economy model that is a smaller size, there are a couple of options on this. So Big Limelight becomes Little Lime, and Little Lime has the potential to get 3 to 5 feet tall and 3 to 5 feet wide. And while it goes from white to chartreuse, it also has this nice dusty pink finish to it before it turns what I call paper bag brown. So you really get lots and lots of color, longevity, but you get interesting color. It's almost like you have different shrubs in the same area of your garden as you go through these color phases. So again, Little Lime, 3 to 5 with a 3 to 5 foot spread. Oh, the one thing I should mention is for all the trade-off for all of these weeks, if not months of flower effect from fresh to dried is the fact that you don't get great fall color on them, with one exception that's coming up. And it's a yellow, but it's not yellow. It's not something you drive to see. It's not leaf peeping yellow. It's just yellow. Pinky Winky, isn't that a cute name? Pinky Winky is one of the first multi-tone or two-tone flowers. As you can see here, it starts white, and even that picture on the left, you can see that pink starting to flush from the bottom. And then as it progresses, it goes from pink to pink and white. And it's kind of almost like a dessert. You have this wonderful two-tone effect on there, which is really, really nice. And Pinky Winky is a larger plant. It has the potential to get 6 to 7 feet tall and 6 to 7 feet wide. Quick fire. Now, this makes a good point, coming up with quick fire. Quick fire and little quick fire, it's more diminutive version. are a full month ahead in bloom of any of the panicle hydrangeas. So there's this whole range. Not only do you get different colors and different sizes with the panicles, but you also have the potential, you could have like peonies where you have early, mid-season, and late. You could actually do a panicle hydrangea garden where you have early with quick fire or little quick fire, and then you could go all the way through and end in September into October with tardiva. So that's really nice to get summer months. So if, for example, you had a home in Wisconsin and you go up there for the entire summer, but you don't leave until the kids are out of school in June, you could do quick fire in your garden and not really feel like you're missing anything. So quick fire, excuse me, gets 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide. The pink on that is a little bit different. I see salmon. When you look at that middle picture, it's more of a salmony pink or a peach pink instead of just a standard pink. And the quick fires and little quick fire are the only two in my mind that give a little bit of a nod to some fall color other than just yellow. So that's quick fire. And then here's little quick fire. Again, this is the very earliest one. It's a full month ahead of its closest competitor. If you notice, you get Bobo was a really, really dense flower. Quick fire and little quick fire, the flower is a little bit looser and a little bit more open, and it gives perhaps a little bit more casual appearance. Matures at 4 feet tall with a 6 foot spread. And again, you can see this is a great example. In the left here, these three plants are out in full baking sun and they are perfectly happy. So up to, I would say, don't go less than 3 to 4 hours. And I would say 4 hours is probably kind of the breaking point, that if you start getting less than 4 hours of direct sun on these panicle types, you're probably going to see an appreciable difference in the amount of flowers that you get. Vanilla strawberry, like quickfire, is that two-tone confection. So it starts white and it turns pink at the bottom and moves up up the flower until you have that pink and white mixture on there, which is really, really pretty. Vanilla strawberry is larger. It gets 7 feet tall with a 5 to 6 foot spread. And then strawberry sundae is again, I call it the dwarf model. This is more on the order of 4 feet tall with a 4 foot spread, and it does exactly the same thing. You can see that you have it starts that beautiful kind of a bridal white color, and then it starts pinking from the bottom. So it really looks like just a great dessert. So strawberry sundae is 4 feet tall with a 4 foot spread. Silver Dollar is a particular favorite of mine. I first saw this years ago at the Old Botanic Garden in Madison, and it was enormous. The plant was 8 feet tall, it was 8 feet wide, and there's a certain amount of gloss to the leaf that the panicle hydrangeas generally don't have. And look at that flower on the right. I mean, it is a big, honking, dense, white flower that is amazing, and the clarity and purity of the white is really extraordinary. So when this goes through its weeks and weeks and weeks like this, and then it goes to its paper bag brown, you really have an amazing plant. And Silver Dollar, as I said, gets 7 to 8 feet tall, and it can be 7 feet wide. So you can really use these as specimen plants, or they're really eye-catching if you do them in odd number, staggered groups of 3 or 5, really can put a lot of color in a shrub border. Now tardiva, I apologize, this picture on the left shows it as it's finishing in the fall. Tardiva generally does not show this white color. It doesn't start blooming until usually end of August or first part of September, hence the name tardiva. It's the very last one. So this would be the one if you were trying to do a panicle hydrangea garden and have everything, the whole range of bloom. Tardiva would be the one that you would have to include because that will take you well into the fall. And tardiva does get bigger. It gets 8 feet tall with an 8 foot spread. White diamonds is a very, to me, it's a little bit similar in the color. The white is so pure. There's nothing cream about it. It's this elegant, elegant, elegant white flower. It's a large flower, but it's a little bit more loose and a little bit more open so you can see into the center of the plant. Very strong stems, more compact than silver dollar. It only matures at about 5 feet tall with a 5-foot spread. And then it will go white and a little bit of pink and then green and then brown. Okay, the oak leaf hydrangeas are another native. And so again, we always love to grow natives whenever we possibly can. This one is tricky and you really need to pay attention to this one. This one you never do a hard cut back on because whatever potential flowers you have, listen carefully, this is very confusing, are from current year's shoots arising from last year's stems. So if for whatever reason, if the rabbits got after this and took it to the ground, if you get a landscaper that pruned it inadvertently and took it all the way back, mistaking it for some other hydrangea, then all potential for flowering would be gone for the year. And it would be a foliage plant. And the nice thing, one of the big attributes of this plant is this plant will do very, very, very deep shade. But understand, the more shade you put it in, the more of a foliage plant it's going to be. And I think I really want to always set good expectations. And I think you should have the expectations. Grow this plant for the amazing, and you're going to see in a minute, this amazing, amazingly textured and colored foliage. It looks like an oak leaf, as you might suspect, Tony, and great fall color. And so if it flowers for you, that's a bonus. While the plant is ironclad hardy to 25 below, the flower buds are the least hardy part of the plant. And if we have temperatures at -10 or below, probably whatever dormant flower buds are sitting there over the winter will probably abort and not grow for you. So the following year, after -15, -20 below, the plant is probably going to be a foliage plant. Amazing. Wait until you see this fall color. The fall color is extraordinary on these. I should put a disclaimer in there. Having grown this plant, deer evidently haven't read the book on this. Deer are always supposed to be deterred by foliage. It's a little fuzzy and a little crisp and just has little hairs all over it. This doesn't seem to bother them. They really like the oak leaf hydrangea, so that's a consideration. And then in the winter, rabbits, I always like to put a chicken wire screen around mine or a hardware cloth screen around mine, because when the snow is deep and the rabbits are hungry, they will come in and they will do winter pruning for you, which you may or may not appreciate. And then again, the amazing fall color. So tolerance, it will tolerate full sun. It prefers part shade because it has this big, big leaf. So it's not, I wouldn't say terribly, terribly, terribly drought tolerant. And then it's very, very, very shade tolerant. So let's take a look at the 3 varieties that I'm recommending. This is Gatsby Pink. And I didn't update this. We had Gatsby Pink last year. I was just out in the nursery this morning looking at the hydrangeas, and we just got a shipment of a variety called Gatsby Gal in. And the interesting thing about the oak leaves are that they have this big conical, it's a little bit like the panicles. You have this beautiful white flower. The thing that's interesting, again, ignore the Gatsby Pink. The variety we have in stock right now is called Gatsby Gal. It has a long period of effectiveness from white, and then it goes to this soft, dusty pink. And then up in the corner, you get a sense of this fall color. You get this deep, it can be purple, it can be black, it can be maroon, it can be orange, or in the same plant, especially if it's out in full sun, it can be all of the above. So you really, you have great leaf, summer leaf, great texture. you have the potential for a great flower, you have great fall color, and then if you have them up close to a patio or a window where you see them during the course of the winter, they have this incredible, these cinnamon colored, this fuzz up and down the stems, which makes them have nice winter bark effect if they're up close enough that you can really see them in the winter when they've defoliated. So Gatsby Gal gets about 4 to 5 feet tall with about a 4 to 5 foot spread. Ruby Slippers is a product of the United States Department of the National Arboretum Breeding Program. As you go farther south, for those of you, like I lived in central Illinois growing up, and the oak leaf hydrangeas would be 7 to 8 feet tall and 7 to 8 feet wide. Well, with downsizing of lots and for containers, people were looking for a smaller oak leaf. So the National Arboretum started breeding, and they came up with this wonderful variety called Ruby Slippers. And Ruby Slippers only gets 3 feet tall with a 4 foot spread, and it has white, and then it goes to this nice, deep, what I would call kind of an antique-y rose pink color that it holds for weeks and weeks and weeks before it goes to the paperback brown. And again, this is what I'm talking about on the right. This exhibits and shows the real range of colors that you have. Potential fall color, you get this maroon purple to almost black. So it's really extraordinary fall color that lasts for a number of weeks. So that's another reason to think about the oak leaf hydrangeas, that and their shade tolerance. And Sykes dwarf is another, obviously dwarf, that gets about 3 feet tall with a 4 foot spread. The primary difference between Sykes dwarf and what I just showed you earlier, the Ruby Slippers, Sykes dwarf holds its white for a longer period of time, and when it finally finishes and ages before it turns paper bag brown, it gets a much softer pink color. But again, 3 feet tall, 3 to 4 feet wide. Climbing hydrangea. This is the hydrangea vine. It is from Asia. And for me, this is probably one of the most elegant and aristocratic vines that you can have. With vines, as you know, you have two families. You either have a clinging vine or an adhering vine, or you have vines that twine. So climbing hydrangea is a clinging vine. So you want to put this on a flat, preferably rough surface, like a brick wall, a solid fence, something like that. And that's when you're going to get the best performance out of it. And I'll talk about that just a bit more in a minute. This will do in sun, or it will do in partial shade, or it will do in full shade. So it's extremely versatile, and you'll see what the attributes are in just a moment here. So this is a more mature climbing hydrangea. And the thing that I think is really cool about it from a design point of view is when you grow Boston ivy has a pretty summer leaf, it has pretty fall color, it has nice berries, but it's very one-dimensional, and it grows, when you look at it, it grows perfectly parallel, and I mean perfectly parallel to whatever the surface is that it's growing on. Look at this hydrangea and look at the depth that you get. And once it starts attaching and filling out the space that it's growing on, you start getting these lateral branches, like my hand sticking out here, that grow perpendicular to the surface that it's growing on. So it gives you a sense of depth, and it gives you a sense of shadow that you don't have with other vines. And it's also kind of important to let those perpendicular branches hang out, because if you notice, that's where all of the flowers are. So if you keep cutting your hydrangea, if you have a limited space for it, and you keep cutting it back so that it's perfectly flush against the wall, you will be cutting the flowers off. And the flowers typically show up end of June, first part of July. So it's a very late spring, very early summer proposition. And again, it's what I would call more of a lace cap flower because it's not a big splashy thing like Annabelle or Incredible. You have all those fertile flowers in the center, and then you have a ring of 1 or 2 sterile flowers around the outer edge there. But it's a nice blast of white against what is a really, really, really dark green leaf. The leaf on this is so handsome and attractive in its own right. I don't care if it ever flowers at my house. Again, you have the wonderful shade tolerance. You have this sense of depth that you get with it. The one comment that I hear from people, and I've been here at Chalet for 33 years, so I've heard it a number of times, is, you know, I put that climbing hydrangea in, you told me it was going to be very exciting, and it's 3 years later, and it's still kind of sitting there. And when I start asking the questions, what I find is that they bought a larger plant and it was either on a stake or on a trellis. And so they planted it away from the structure or the support that they wanted it to grow on. And they didn't remove it from the trellis. And I've never read anything about it. There's probably a great grad student project in there somewhere. But my sense is that once that plant starts attaching and sending out those little aerial rootlets to whatever it's attaching to, it changes the hormone balance of the plant. And that's when the plant takes off and really starts growing and really starts spreading. And that's when you're going to start getting that coverage. And while I'm thinking about it, I should probably tell you so that I can save you the question at the end. How big does a climbing hydrangea get? It gets as big as the support that it's growing on and as wide as the support that's growing on if you don't do any pruning. So literally, I have seen it grow to the top of the eaves of a 3-story building, and it can get 30 or 40 feet long. If you were doing this on a wall and you wanted complete coverage and you were asking me the spacing, I would say you could probably put them 6 feet apart and 6 to 8 feet apart on centers. And at that kind of centers, they will eventually grow horizontally in together. So what you might do is put them from post to post and then let them grow into to the center. But the important thing is when you plant them, if they're on a stake or on a trellis and you're not going to take them off that, then you have to plant them as flush as you can up against the surface that they're growing on. They really need to attach from the bottom and start growing up. That's when you're going to get the best growth on them, and that's when they're going to start really filling in for you. So love, love, love climbing hydrangea. Oh, the other cool thing, then there's also winter effect with it. Once it starts getting a heavy diameter stem, the bark starts peeling and exfoliating on it. So for those of you that have river birch or have seen that nice cinnamon colored bark from a river birch, the climbing hydrangea will do that same thing when the stems start getting 3/4 of an inch or so in diameter. So in the winter, you'll have these wonderful kind of flaky hanging bark peeling off and hanging on there when the leaves are off. Also does fall color. Is there anything this plant doesn't do? It gives you a wonderful summer flower. It has a great summer leaf. It has very nice, clear yellow gold fall color. And then you have that wonderful bark, that exfoliating bark that makes for great winter character. And there is one more, there's a bonus plant. This is Miranda, and Miranda is the variegated form. This shows it a little, I'm not sure this is overexposed or whatever, but if you notice toward the top, you have a dark green center, and then you have that cream. It's not really cream, it's really more gold. And that really is kind of an interesting contrast, especially I have mine on a north wall of a building of my house. And when you walk around that side of the house, what would otherwise be fairly dark, that really turns the lights on in that situation and really lights up that color. Like most of the plants that are variegated, it has less chlorophyll. So it's a little bit, I wouldn't say less hardy, but it's not as vigorous a grower. So that kind of concludes the presentation of Tony's 25 All-Star Hydrangeas. And now I'm going to call on my techno wizards, and we're going to see if I've accumulated any questions.
Yes, if you have any questions, please write in the chat box we have.
This is why I just do the plants. We're working on it, folks.
Okay, so we have
Okay.
do you want to read them or do you want me to read them?
Okay. All right. Jerry has a question. How do you tell old wood from new wood in the fall? Jerry, that's a really good question. Old wood, if it has been growing in 2020, then next year that's going to be old wood. So you really don't even have to think about it. It's whatever's on the plant in the fall or there first thing in the spring. The new growth is what you're going to be seeing occurring, and the stems will be a light green color during the course of the summer. Okay, fertilizer for limelight. Again, you have to be really careful. I should reiterate this again. You have to be really careful over fertilizing the hydrangeas, especially nitrogen, that very, very first number in a fertilizer analysis, so like a 10, 15, 10, that first 10 is nitrogen, and that's what gives you leaf growth and leaf color. And hydrangeas are little nitrogen pigs. And so if you're pushing them with a lot of nitrogen, you will get lots and lots and lots of leaf growth, but the hormone balance will be such that the plant is not in a reproductive state and it won't produce a lot of flowers. So when you're choosing a fertilizer for the Panicle hydrangeas, or actually any of the hydrangeas, what you want a ratio of 1 to 1.5 to 2 to 1. So that second number should be twice as large, or can even be higher. So I mentioned that Dr. Earth bulb food, which is a 3-14-2. So you've got a 4 to 1 ratio of nitrogen. So keep that nitrogen probably below 6 and get the phosphorus up to 8%, 10% or more. And that'll do a really, really nice job for you. But the panicles, if you feed them once, that's probably enough. With the mop heads, I think I failed to say that you should feed them a second time. So you feed them once when you're doing your spring cleanup, then 4 to 6 weeks later, as they've started flushing growth and they're starting to form flower buds, give them a second application. Great question. Okay, from Libby, I have dappled shade on the east side of my house, and the south side is under a huge cottonwood. Is there a hydrangea that will tolerate that? Well, again, dappled doesn't count as full sun. So the question is, Libby, how much sun do you get? If you are less than 4 hours of direct sun a day, if you're at 3 hours of shade, 3 hours of sun or dappled sun, you probably should be looking at one of the smooth hydrangeas. So probably Annabelle, Incredible, Wee White, any of those first 5 varieties that I showed you, those are the ones that are going to be most shade tolerant. Or you go to an oak leaf hydrangea and the oak leaves will tolerate that kind of shade. Okay, from Ashley, can we move Ashley down just a little bit so I can see the top of lost top of the question, I'm sorry. There we go. I'm interested. Okay, Ashley's asking, I'm interested in the climbing hydrangeas. I have a flower bed that abuts a wall, and the bed is about 3 feet by 12 feet. Do you think the climbing hydrangea would dominate the flower bed, making it harder to allow the other plants in the bed to flourish? No, I think the only thing that you would have to worry about, Ashley, is the fact that once that plant fills up, that's after it's been in 2 or 3 years and starts spreading and starts sending out those perpendicular branches that are perpendicular to the wall, you will get some depth, and sometimes you can get streamers coming out that are 10 to 12 inches. So that 3-foot depth of bed, when you say 3 feet, I'm assuming you're talking that's the depth of it. That could take up a portion of that. So that's just something that I would consider. And again, you can cut that off and you can cut that back and keep the plant flush with the wall within 4 to 6 inches of the wall, so that you still have more than 2.5 feet of depth. So that's up to you, but you would probably need to prune it off if the bed is that shallow. From Cara, can they be transplanted easily if sited wrong initially? Cara, that depends upon how long they've been in the ground. If they are just a year old, if you put something in last year and it didn't perform the way you wanted it to, and you think you've got a better spot for it, you can go ahead and do that. Early spring would be preferable to doing it now, going in the heat of the summer. But if the plant has only been in for a year, you probably still have a root ball that's fairly compact. So just take a little bit larger root ball and move that, and make sure that the day or so before you do that, water it really, really, really thoroughly. And if it's going to be 95 degrees for 3 or 4 days and you're moving it from a shade spot to a sunnier spot, hold off and do it when the temperatures are cooler. But absolutely can be done. They have a fairly compact root system. You just want to make sure you water them really well. And after transplanting, you want to really keep after them and keep them moist when it gets hot. From Susan, I have 2 bobos, one flowers a lot, and the other did not get any flowers. They are right next to each other. Susan, that's interesting. I had that situation 2 years ago where I have 2 groupings of 3, and they both get equal sunlight. And I don't know if I pruned one group harder or not, but the one group had very, very sparse flowers, and the other group, literally you couldn't see the foliage. So the thing I would say to you is if they're getting an equal amount of sun, Bobo is not a particularly heavy feeder. It's just a matter of make sure that you don't prune it too hard in the spring, because all of those panicle hydrangeas are slower to respond to pruning than Annabelle. So I should make that point. I don't think I made it strongly enough earlier. When you prune a panicle, do it really, really lightly. You never want to do a hard cut back on them, because if you do, you're probably going to dramatically reduce or eliminate the flowers that you get from them in the same year. From Sherry, for container hydrangeas, is there a preferred material or container? No, I think when you're doing containers, so much of the container, the importance of the container is the aesthetics of it. So you just have to know that if you do them in a clay pot or terracotta pot, the terracotta can be beautiful, especially if you're doing a terracotta, an Italian terracotta pot. The only thing you need to remember is that hydrangeas, being moisture lovers, that you will be needing to water more frequently than you would if you have it in a glazed pot or a decorative plastic pot. And the important thing is to make sure that you have drainage. From Liz, can you talk about Hydrangea serrata? Sure, I can. What would you like me to talk about? Hydrangea serrata are the mountain hydrangeas, and they, to me, there's a bit of a downside with them. They are genetically programmed to come out earlier in the spring. And so to me, they sometimes can, if we had a little bit of warm weather, they sometimes can be far enough along that we can have a freeze, and that can knock them back a little bit. So serratas are not one that I generally do, and we've had them in the past. We may even have one variety out there right now, and I'm blanking on the name. But generally, they're not the first variety or the first family that we recommend. From Sandra, can you send us the PowerPoint presentation and handouts via email? We will take that offline, and will you note that for me? Sandra, thank you. From Usha, when covering Nico Blue, should the crown be covered or just the ground around the stems? If you have a Nico Blue, I guess I would ask you, how many times in the last 5 years or 10 years have you had it flower for you? Nico Blue is an older variety that has been superseded by many of the new varieties, and the real limitation of Nico Blue is it only flowers on your old wood. So even if you protect it, if that plant, for whatever reason, if we have a bad winter and it freezes all the way to the ground, no matter what you do, that plant is always going to be a foliage plant. So your question is, you want to try, and I'm not being judgmental. I would just say if I had Nico Blue, I would go to the garage and get the spade or the shovel and dig it out and throw it away and get a variety that's hardier, that you don't have to do so much work with. But you have the Nico Blue, so if you're going to cover it with the bark, I would say you need to cover it up at least 10 to 12 inches. Because the stems that arise from the base are not going to produce flowers. You only have potential for flowers the following year from whatever stem tissue grew the year before. So you have to protect that. From Lawrence, have enjoyed these sessions, but work takes me in and out of the ongoing discussion. Is there a way to replay these excellent sources of information? Lawrence, we will take your information offline and try and get back to you. Usha is back again, and oh, she just wanted to finish her statements. When covering the Nico blue with mulch, I would not use something that has small particle size. I would use something like the medium or large chunk bark that is not going to pack, and you're going to have drainage through there of rain and melting snow, and you're also going to have air circulation. Okay. From Sandra, when is it best to cut back endless summer hydrangeas? Typically on those moped types, you want to do that when you're doing your spring cleanup. So late March, early April, when you're going in to see how they fared for the winter, that would be when you would do whatever pruning you're going to do. Because if you prune them back later, probably most of your flowering is going to come from this year's flowers or this year's stems. So if you cut them back later, the later you cut them and the harder you cut them back, the more potential flowers you're cutting off. I have something, the store purchase plants in the garage over the winter. They always flower when I bring them out. Do I need to garage them always? Sue doesn't say what kind of hydrangeas they are. In the spring, we get in April for Easter, we always get these big florist forcing hydrangeas so that you can have your containers looking great in April for the month of April. But those are a different set of varieties, and they are not winter hardy or they're not garden hardy. So if you're taking any of the hydrangeas that we talked about today and you have them in a container, there's no question. Anytime you put something in a container, you dramatically increase the likelihood that the plant may die over the winter because you may have freeze damage into the root system in the center of the pot. So in containers, we always say a minimum size that's acceptable is 18 by 18 by 18 cubed. And 24 by 24 by 24 would be better because the more soil you have around there, the less chance it has to freeze all the way into the center and kill the plant. And even then in a container, if you can, since hydrangeas don't have a lot of winter interest in a container probably, if you can move that, get a dolly and move that container into the garage, even that 3 to 4 to 5 degree buffer of temperatures being milder in the garage will help increase the likelihood of that plant making it through the winter. In the winter, any of these landscape plants that you take in the garage, make sure to remember to give them supplemental water. They're not getting rainfall, they're not getting snowfall, but they're still dehydrating. So check them once a month and give them a good drink even in the garage. Let's see, I've lost track here. And Allison would like to be notified an opportunity to replay as well. From Sue, my container plants are blue when they bloom. Shall I continue? Okay, Sue, again, garaging them in the winter, I would say yes if they're in containers. That has no bearing on whether they're going to be blue, except for the fact, as I mentioned earlier, if you have them in a container, you can control the pH and increase the likelihood of having them bloom blue by giving them either aluminum sulfate and or sulfur. And here's another one that would like the PowerPoint. Tanya. And I got to thank you. And let's see. I think, okay, now we're moving. Okay, how well do they do? There's a question here, I don't have a name. How well do they do in pots in zone 5? Again, if you put them in the largest pot possible, take the hardiest varieties. I probably would, if you want to really be serious about reblooming these the following year, I'd be more tempted to do something like an Annabelle or an Incredible type, or I would do any of the Panicle types, as I mentioned earlier. They are just going to be more ironclad hardy in a container. Jerry, we got that. What is the best way to support Annabelle hydrangeas? That's a really, really good question. And again, Annabelle, the factors that are going to affect Annabelle doing what I call, as I mentioned earlier, the flopping and slopping. It's going to be the more shade you put them in, the more you fertilize them, with a high nitrogen fertilizer. And this is a point I made in last week's class. And I ask people a lot when they come in the store, they have a hydrangea and Annabelle is out in sun and it's growing and it's so big and whatever. If it's adjacent to a lawn area, and you have a lawn service that uses a granular, and they use a what I call a rotary spreader that flings the fertilizer. You may not be fertilizing that hydrangea, but if they are throwing a high nitrogen lawn fertilizer in that bed, that hydrangea is not going to differentiate between that and what it's supposed to be getting. And so it's going to respond by being very, very, very lush. So Annabelle's, the biggest thing is to avoid some of the things that are going to cause it to be that big anyway. There are larger tomato cages and big hoop cages, and those are probably the best way. And the thing to do is to get those on as early in the season as possible, to let the plants grow up through that, as opposed to trying to lasso the plant into a torpedo and then try and get this support of any kind over the top of the plant without breaking the stems over. Generally doesn't work very well. And that's true of anything that you're whether it's a perennial or whether it's a peony or a hydrangea, anything that you're going to support. If you take the support down for the winter and store it, get it out there as early as possible in the spring when you're doing your spring cleanup. Is there a handout available with photos? We're going to have to address that. And let's see. Kathleen, why do some hydrangeas never bloom, and will fertilizing help? If you have something like the lady that has the Nico Blue, if you have a variety of mophead that blooms, if it's older and it only blooms on year-old wood, the chances are every winter, unless you really, really work at it to protect it from dying all the way back to the ground, it's probably never going to bloom. And as I mentioned earlier, fertilizer will make a difference with the mophead types because they're heavier feeders. So Bloomstruck, Summer Crush, those varieties, Twist and Shout, those varieties are more responsive to fertilizer. So, but again, remember, if you're putting something in shade, the last thing you want to do is fertilize and fertilize and fertilize. And that's not just about hydrangeas. If you put a sun plant in shade and you think you're going to force flowers on it by fertilizing it, it's not going to make any difference. So you only fertilize. Fertilizer is only going to make a difference if the plant is getting an appropriate amount of sun, and you probably haven't been fertilizing at all. Marcia also would like to listen to the presentation again. Oh, and Marcia, any tips on drying the flowers? Ooh, I'm not one of those crafty people. I think you probably want to get them when the flowers are fully open, but just fully open. And then it's a matter of cutting them, I would think, and again, I'm kind of winging this, and I don't like to wing it, but I would get them in the morning when the moisture levels are at their highest, but after the flower, any dew is off the flowers. And I don't think I'd be doing that when in high humidity, and then cut them and hang them upside down in a spot where there's going to be good air circulation. There's lots and lots and lots of Google things, Google sites that you can go that will be much more informative about this than I am, I assure you. Another handout request, PowerPoint. And wow, everybody's wanting the PowerPoint. Okay, presentation. And here's another one that must have missed it earlier. Can a mature plant be transplanted to a new location? You can do anything, but I would say if it's a mature plant, when I hear mature plant, I'm thinking you mean that it's 3 or more years old, has been in the ground. And what has happened is the root system is really, really dispersed out. And so with a hydrangea being moisture lovers the way they are, what I would say is if you can plan 6 months or a year in advance, what I would do is determine how big a root ball you can physically handle and move. And so in September, go in with your spade and go all the way around and put the spade down and sever roots, and leaving whatever, size root ball, 12, 24, 18 inches, whatever you can physically handle next year. But by severing those roots in September, we call that root pruning. And the idea is that by making those cuts back behind that, that will upset the hormone balance of the plant, and you'll have a much heavier, fuller proliferation of roots when you transplant it in the spring. Because remember, in the fall, as long as soil temperatures are above 40 degrees, plants are still making root growth and establishing themselves. So you can still get a lot of root growth in the fall. And then what I would do is move the plant in March or April. And while it's still dormant, I would say don't try and move a mature plant when it is in leaf in the summer. I think that could be pretty tricky. You're going to be really watering that plant a lot over the course of the summer. So do it either in the fall or do it in the spring as the plant is either in dormancy or going into dormancy. And okay, and I think that's it. Do we see any more? I think that's about those. And what we will do is we will try and address the being able to access the PowerPoint again and also the handout. So I thank you all for attending. And okay, so if people want the notes, here is the email at Hello Chalet. So for those of you that want to get a copy of the handout, email at Hello Chalet, and we will get that to you. So thank you all for attending. See you next week at 10 o'clock. Bye-bye.